Welcome to this episode of Smart Semiotics. And today's seminar is about the connection between cognitive states and facial displays and how the body, predominantly the face, can convey or express inner states, not just passions or emotions. This talk will present a historical recount of discoveries as well as recent research that points to the existence of probabilistic relationships between cognition and facial actions. So let me welcome our speaker, Alan Crawley from Buenos Aires, specialist in nonverbal communications with a background in psychology. He is professor at USAL and the coordinator of the postgraduate course on nonverbal communication at Heritage University, as well as scientific researcher for the Universidad del Salvador. Crawley is also active on social network under the pseudonym Sinverba, if you want to look him up. And before we start, I will also thank you to Paul and Zbigniew, who behind the scene allow for all this to be organized and running smoothly as ever. And also let me welcome quickly our very international panel of experts, starting with Rukmini Nair, distinguished poet and writer, and also emerita professor from New Delhi, Monica Rector, emeritus from the University of North Carolina, and connecting from Rio de Janeiro, and Clara Chapdelaine Feliciati, professor at Xian Tong Liverpool University, Domenico Pietropaolo, from emeritus professor from the University of Toronto, and finally Remo Gramigna, professor at the University of Torino. So thank you everybody for joining us in this webinar, and now I will leave the stage to Alan Crawley for his talk. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Gabriel, for the invitation, especially to Paul. It's a pleasure being here, and thanks for the excellent and warm welcome you gave me. So today I'm going to talk about the facial displays of cognitions, a topic which I think has been understudied in the field of nonverbal communication. And over the past 10 years, I have tried to study in the most overarching perspective that I could, how different aspects of nonverbal communication could be expressed and applied in different contexts, such as in sports, in the military, in the police, with clinicians, in psychotherapy, but also considering how the different body channels could convey information with the face, the eyes, the body, and the voice. And in that endeavor, I found that there are some aspects, some channels, or maybe specific topics that haven't received enough attention. So let's open the curtain of this kind of show we're going to have today about the facial displays of how our mental activity could be reflected in the way we move our facial muscles. And I want to start with the 4 reasons which got me interested in this subject. So first and foremost, I read an article on the blog, American Scientific blog, in which they show like a progression in which researchers were understanding how pupils dilate. And Eckhart Hess, the founder of pupillometry, found that pupils increase their size whenever we see something that is attracted to ourselves, or we feel sexually attracted, and also when we are interested in something. But in time, people like Danny Kahneman found out that memory recall, or being on a task that needs you to think about taking difficult elections or choices, makes you also increase the size of your pupils. So that got me thinking, well, there may be visual cues, mostly on the face, that could reveal through physiological changes how someone is thinking about something, how the mind is working, or if it is experiencing mental effort. The second research I found was regarding to blinking. Generally speaking, when we are concentrated on where we are reading, blinking rate decreases. And it's very interesting because at moments prior to huge cognitive loads or after huge cognitive loads, there's a burst of blinks like expressing or releasing the cognitive effort that has been done at the given moment. So there could be a second a facial cue that could be related to how someone is assessing information in the inside of the brain. And the third reason is a more recent one. It's a paper published by a colleague and a friend of mine, Vincent Deneau from Canada, a bibliometric study of the 1,000 most cited articles on nonverbal visible behavior, in which he found that from the 1,000 most cited, 402 were or have facial expression in the title, showing something very, very profound. The facial expressions have been the most studied topic in nonverbal communication. But what I have found looking through the articles is that most of them see the face through the lens of emotions. They are assuming that the face is predominantly showing emotions, but in my experience, in conversations, in daily life, what I see in the movements of the face of other people is usually related to conversations, to cognitions, and in some cases, emotions. So I felt that the research was not reflecting what I was experiencing in reality. And the fourth reason is that I took my time and looked for the most known textbooks and most important textbooks in nonverbal communication, like 2021 Burgun, Manusov, Laura Guerrero, the APA handbook from Matsumoto, Wang, and Mark Frank, the one from edited by 2013, Judy Hall and Mark Knapp, the one edited by Ekman and Rosenberg, the one from Marcel Danesi, I think published last year, The Science of Facial Expression from Fernando Stoltz in Madrid and James Russell, Fernando Poyatos, Interdisciplinary Studies of Nonverbal Communication, Alan Friedlund. And what I have found is that there is no book dedicated entirely to facial displays of cognitions. There is not one chapter on the matter, and there are only just few mentions on how the face could be related mostly to conversational messages and a little bit of how it could be related to mental activity. There are some popular books that talk about and mention possibilities of cognitions related to facial actions, but there is no profound discourse and theory about the subject. And the other thing that I have found, and this is quite curious to me, is that most of the research done at the moment relating facial displays with the mental activity are being published in electrical, electronical, software, and computer science journals, which shows something quite surprising in the sense that they are looking for the kind of displays to be recognized and used in computer vision softwares, but maybe the theory behind those software could be faulty, as it happens to be in several of the software that are being used with the typical approach of the basic 5, 6, or 7 emotions. So I think it's time to bring something to the table. And in my experience, it was like, okay, I feel like Columbus. I find something new. I'm discovering a virgin and explored territory. And that's not the case. I'm not the first one, not the second one, not the third. There have been a lot of important researchers over decades that have shown us and point us like there is something here, but no one dedicated too much time to it. So maybe it's time. I don't know. So let's go and dive into in a brief historical history of these facial displays of cognitions. And I want to start with whom I recognize as the most important author in facial expressions, the Guillaume Duchenne du Boulogne, the French anatomist. He was an excellent and very ethical researcher. There's a letter he sent to Darwin when he gave him the photographs he used for research. And he wrote in that letter that no questions of money should emerge between men of science. And it was like, that's huge, Duchenne. You were doing things very, very well. And in his book from 1862, he addressed the subject of higher understanding states that could be reflected in the face, such as attention, reflection, which is something like attention directed to the inside, doubt, and meditation that have some correlation between facial actions. Then it came Darwin with his famous book, the 1872, The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals. And in his chapter 9, he addressed the subject of complex emotions. There are some emotions that have something of cognitive, something of affect or emotive, like reflection, meditation, determination, and ill temper. But most importantly, I think, what he recognizes was an evolutionary script on why we should have these displays or these experiences in the inside, in the sense that what triggers them It could be an obstacle in the chain of thought, a task interruption, which is nothing else than also an obstacle, or the recognition that more effort is needed, which is also a recognition of an obstacle. Then it came an Italian, Sante di Sanctis. And I lied a little bit. This is just the one book dedicated to facial displays of cognitions. It's called La Mimica del Pensiero, the mimic, the movement of thought, which is impossible to get. It's only in Italian. I couldn't get it, so I had to read some reviews on the matter. And he put some questions to test, like, are the thought processes seen in the face? What is the relationship between emotion and cognition? Is there an evolutionary expression of thought, which he argues is related to frowning? And very insightfully, he proposes that the displays of the mental states tend to be, in comparison with the emotional expressions, involve fewer facial movements, are less intense, and less evident, which one could argue that, in essence, that could show us that facial displays of cognitions could be more related to how we think than rather to send social messages. This is to start talking about the different hypotheses that are going developed over time. Then it came a painter, Eduardo Cuyer, with the book The Mimic, published in 1906. And he addressed several independent movements of the body that he related to the expression of inner states. And I put here some of the ones that are related to cognitions. So for instance, if you raise your eyebrows, he would argue this related to being attentive on something, looking for an answer like, okay, let me give you an answer on this matter, or not wanting to reply, like, I'm not going to tell you the answer, so sorry, this is what you've got. A second one could be the frowning. That could be related to reflection and inner attention. Raising just one eyebrow, action unit number 2 in the facial action coding system developed by Ekman, which has been very, very important to understand the different facial movements over time. That could be related to attention that is somehow interrogative, and to express, hey, this is difficult to understand. Maybe you should explain this slower. I hope I'm not going too much on a speedy way, you know. And last but not least, the narrowing of the eyes. That's Cuyer related it to detecting or thinking in an objection or an obstacle, just like Darwin, and a way to express skepticism. And of course, more in our times, these two important figures, Irenaeus Abel Abelsfeld, the founder of human ethologists, posit that there are emotional signals as well as conversational signals that we can send with the same facial movements. For instance, you can raise your eyebrows to express, I am in doubt, I am questioning about something, or I am highlighting what I am saying, just like I am doing at the moment. And of course, the most known psychologist in the study of facial expressions, Paul Ekman, has argued in 1979 that the face has also non-emotional communicative function, in which maybe these are the ones we should take some attention to them. And he argued that there are indicators of cognitive process and that we could send some cues with the face about skepticism and disbelief. So this is a brief recount of how the progression of the study of cognitions and their concomitant displays has been studied. And what it crept into my mind, what appeared in my mind was that it needs more attention. But before we try to uncover or unveil this complexity, maybe we should change the way we see the face. Why I argue this? Because as I told you in the bibliometric study, the 1000 papers, there's too much emphasis on emotions, and also the display rules that change culturally that argue that when you can express that emotion, to whom, in what situation, and what intensity. And I think that we have focused too much on the tree and stopped seeing the forest. You know, Dr. Kettler, a follower of Ekman, make this huge comment, which I think is very, very important. The emphasis on the prototypical displays, these 5, 6, or 7 facial expression of emotions that are culturally recognized, cross-culturally recognized, has generated an empirical literature that is relatively silent with respect to the more subtle, varied, and complex, and perhaps even idiosyncratic ways in which people express most of their emotions in real life. Maybe we could also add cognitions, intentions, thoughts, attitudes, traits to that phrase, but it also works. So what I'm trying to say is that maybe we should start to see the forest and consider like a more comprehensive list of the reasons why the face moves. It's not just because of emotions. It executes actions as talking, chewing, and talking. It moves as a result of reflexes like being startled, as a way of conveying social attitudes like I'm being dominant, I'm being assertive, as a way to unconsciously or non-consciously mimic the expression of others, imitations, synchrony, as a way to illustrate words, as a way to send conversational feedback like, I agree with you, I don't agree, I understand, as a way to express help. It's very interesting. Axelsson from Sweden has published an article on the appearance of the face and its relationship with how healthy you could be based on inducing viruses in the participants. Very, very interesting. The face could show us sensation like cold or pain, which is a very important thing to recognize if you are a clinician. And the face moves as a consequence of idiosyncratic factors and also professional and situational factors. Like if you are a police officer, you are in the military, you have different constraints on how to move your face. And of course, maybe I'm forgetting it, but I'm not, cognitions. Like doubt, like confusion, like concentration. So maybe there is something here, but maybe we should change the way we see the face. So at the moment, there are basically four most prominent theories on how to infer meaning out of the facial movements. And three out of these four are related to emotion, except the one developed by Alan Friedlund, the behavioral ecological view. The basic emotion theory is the most known. I'm not going to put to it much attention, just sum up that there are something 6, something 7 basic emotions like sadness, fear, and anger that are expressed in a prototypical fashion with a given set of facial muscle and movements. The behavioral ecological view posits that the face moves not as a consequence of emotions, rather as a way to commerce socially your intentions and accomplish your objectives, not related to emotions. The dimensional theory from James Russell argues that all emotions could be classified in 4 quadrants divided by 2 dimensions, the affective dimension, positive and negative, and the arousal dimension. But the one that is going to be most interesting for us, if you're going to study the facial displays of cognitions, is the one developed by Klaus Scherer, which I think is one of the most understudied also, which hasn't received so much attention and maybe as it should if we were looking for different cues rather than simplistically these discrete 7 emotions. Now there's an argument that there are 19, 21, 22. I'm not going to enter in that. I'm just going to develop a little bit on the appraisal theory of Klaus Scherer. And he argues that there are several dimensions that the brain is constantly seeing in the reality and assessing and making conclusions of it. So, for instance, these dimensions could be related to something novel, to if something is requires urgency, if it's important, not important, and maybe the face provokes or produces some cues that reveal how we are assessing reality. So, for instance, raising the upper eyelids is related to the dimension of perceiving something novel, something that it's predictable or unpredictable, something that is sudden, or it's related to the expectations. The downturn of the corners of the mouth, he says it's related to perceiving that something is from low urgency, like it's not important, I don't care, I don't mind, this is not for me, it doesn't require me to take immediate action. The raising of both eyebrows is related to perceiving something that is unexpected, maybe, and the pressure of one of the lip corners toward itself, toward the teeth, is related to the perception of something that could be frustrating or injustice. So we need to take this in consideration, but also recognize that during a conversation, it is difficult to identify each of the evaluation instances, as well as to differentiate between what is purely cognitive and what is interactive. What is really cognitive and what is really social? That's a question that we can still not answer yet. which Mark Frank would tell us it's very similar to the one we have relating to if we can, just by observation, know if that expression is spontaneous or deliberate. So please take into consideration this is a draft, a first draft on what could be the mental activities, these cognitive states that somehow or sometimes are considered epistemological emotions, modal emotion, knowledge emotions, intellectual expressions. There is no consensus yet, which I think show us that, hey, we should chat and talk about how we can order these things and to better understand them and study them more consciously. You could see there that I put surprise. I have a lot of reasons for putting surprise there. I took a slide that explained it because of time constraints, but there's an interesting article published by Paul Ekman in which he surveyed the 150 researchers in the emotional field, and half of them, 1 out of 2, responded that they didn't consider surprise a basic emotion, which I agree, since it has no valence. The facial feedback hypothesis doesn't produce the same effects that produce in with the other basic emotions, and there are other reasons, but just justifying myself on why I put this surprise there that could be controversial, you know. So maybe you're questioning, maybe you are thinking, okay, so how do these displays may work really in social interactions? How do these kind of displays may help us better understand our colleagues, our friends, other people? So I just bring 3 examples. There are much more. Of course, for time limits, I try to be the most, try to bring some illustrative cases. And one of those is the recognition, which is very obvious, but important, that to have a successful interaction, we have to identify speaker social messages. We need to understand what people are telling us, both verbally and non-verbally. And Judy Holler, which is one of the people that are studying at the moment facial expressions of conversation, and I asked her a couple of questions before this event. In one of her articles, she shows that blinking, which is usually a non-conscious behavior, and it is the most frequent facial action we do every day, and we are not so conscious of it, could be used more consciously to say, I agree with you, I understand you. A more prolonged blinking that could be related first with how I am cognitively assessing the situation, but also as a way of expressing, hey, I did understand you. So simultaneously, it could work both ways. It could work, it works just as conversational messages. We still don't know. And that's one of the arguments. Alex Martinez, a pretty interesting engineer, published an article that posits something like this, that facial actions may express the result of a cognitive act as well as an interactive message. And in this very interesting article, he found that there is a cross-cultural facial expression of no, the not face. The face we usually make, even if we speak the American Sign Language, to express, I don't agree with you, that's the answer is no, which is the one you're seeing in the photograph. And there's also a very, very interesting article published by Babelas and Choville, in which they argue that there is an stylized facial expression, not necessarily a byproduct of cognitive effort, used to indicate that conversational turn is not over. So it's like putting a face of, I'm thinking hard of what you are telling me, but please don't interrupt me. I'm not giving you my turn to talk. So I'm thinking, please wait, I'm going to give you an answer. But I'm showing you in a stylized manner that I'm thinking in what you are telling me. But please don't interrupt me. I think it's kind of interesting of think about how a facial expression usually that appears while thinking is stylized and exaggerated so others can understand that we under the influence of being a cognitive act, but also to show them in a conversational manner, hey, I'm thinking. So from now on, I'm going to move on to the theoretical proposals that I have for the future and to a better understanding of these kind of messages, as well as showing you 3 conclusions that I think are important for understanding these facial displays. So what I'm going to show about right now it's a theoretical idea. It's my hypothesis of how the progression of these expressions worked. But of course, I'm not sure it's the case. It's just a working hypothesis. So what could be the origin of these facial displays? Well, facial movements were used mostly to improve information acquisition and assessment of that information, maybe to enhance perception, like raising the eyebrows or raising the eyelids to improve the acquisition of light. Maybe you narrow your eyes as closing the curtains to allow some stimuli to go out, and you can focus on the obstacle, on the thing you want to treat. And over time, you could see that the comparison between the neutral and the different movements of the face. And over time, they become entangled. Actions become associated with distinctive mental states and processes. So a typical form performance is developed. A typical way of narrowing the eyes, a typical way of raising the eyebrows, like for instance, Irenaeus Eberfeld talked about the eye flash, the eyebrow flash that lasts 1/6 of a second to show cross-culturally that you are happy to see someone you know. Well, a typical performance is started to develop with these facial actions related to cognitive states, and others could understand, hey, he's seeing something that is surprising, he's attending to new information, he's concentrated. And over time, and I am not sure, it's a possibility to know, at least to me, what could be the time frame, but those movements, those facial displays, by ritualization and stylization, adopted a typical intensity performance. So it's not just the form that the face adopts, it's also about the velocity, the strength, the amplitude, the rhythm, and the direction these kind of expressions tend to adopt. And I think that Desmond Morris' observation on this could be very useful. Maybe this displays develops its own typical intensity. It becomes more stereotyped without being stereotyped at expenses of losing the amount of information provided, but with the positive aspect of eliminating signal ambiguity. So when we see someone frowning, we could think he's in pain, he's experiencing anger, he could be concentrated, but most of the time we know if that expression is expressing confusion or not. Most of the time we can understand it, that was confusion rather than anger. Why? Because it is performed at a certain typical intensity. But there's a problem. There are no prototypes. And that brings into question that in many times we can't understand completely what the other person is expressing. For instance, the other day I was talking with Judy Hall, and she gave me an example. One of her colleagues was telling her about her research, and she was like, okay, I'm concentrating, trying to understand, and she was frowning. And the other person told her, you don't like my idea, right? And she was like, no, no, no. I'm just concentrating hard because I don't understand it well and I want to understand it well. So these mismatches between the inner state and the inference people make are common, but they are useful because humans need a flexible, complex system of communication. And we were not, I think, Alan Friedman will argue that we should not develop a stereotype and unflexible system to communicate. So these things happen, but also help us to communicate more clearly. And I bring here 3 reflections, which I think are important. 1, these states, cognitive states, mental activities, could be called modal emotions. Facial expressions are not seen as readouts of motor programs or emotions, but as indicator of mental states and evaluation process. Klaus Scherer, the one who I think crafted the better mental model to understand these facial displays, I think gives one of our clear answers to how we should pursue and understand these displays. And I think it's also very interesting to know that attempts to link facial actions to appraisal dimensions are not only of theoretical interest. I'm not only theoretically interested in this, they become crucial as soon as we go beyond the question of universality of emotional expression and aim to study spontaneous facial expression in social interaction. And last but not least, just my opinion, the interest on this topic is emerging slowly. Its research and application, it is only going to increase the future of computer vision applications on modeling, analyzing, and synthesizing social signal processing. I think that we should not follow the mistakes of the past. We should change them. We should not adopt the same prototypical methods, the closed methods. We should be more creative and learn from the mistakes of the past. So what are the takeaway home points, which I think that it's like, okay, this is something we should consider? Well, as people have emotional goals, they also have intellectual goals related to knowing, thinking, and understanding. Cognitive activities are constant. We are always under some cognitive activity in several different and independent dimensions, like novelty, urgency. There are sequences of mental assessments that are visible in the face. Some of them we can see in the face, but not every cognitive activity will be reflected on the face. That's something important to know. We cannot see through the face of others and see the mind. The mind is not a book we can read through the face. That's not how it works, of course. We need consensus in definitions and granularity of differentiating perplexity from doubt, from uncertainty. We need more granularity, I think so. Facial displays of cognition offer indicators of how someone is processing information. That could be very interesting for teachers in educational context, for meetings, for sales. I think in the future, the limits are creative. And these displays tend to occur prior to an action execution or a decision, usually activated by effort, perception of novelty, or an obstacle. With the more poetical and precise words, arise at junctures of social plans. That's what Oatley and Johnson Laird expressed, which I think it's quite okay. That's nice. I wouldn't have said it better. It's also difficult to differentiate between what's cognitive and what's social. I think that question is going to pop up in the future once and again every time. And last but not least, this is my most interesting hypothesis, I think, based on what I have read. These mental activities, if we think about confusion, being in doubt, uncertainty, overall seem to motivate motor inaction, movement inhibition, the reduction of movement, the overall reduction of movement of the body, more prolonged postures, and they act as platforms as transitory states. You are confused. Okay, so that confusion motivates you to understand better the subject or avoid the subject. You are surprised, you stop everything you're doing, you optimize your mental resources at the expenses of not moving yourself. You try to understand, and once you understand it, it's a platform to move on to the next thing. That's how I think they could work. So we are getting to the end of this, and I'm sure the panel is going to have very insightful questions that I want to answer in as a possible and most interesting way as I can. But first, I want to give 3 conclusions that I think are something that we should take into consideration for the future. So one is a poetical one from Eduardo Cuéllar, the painter, which is the body does not keep the same attitude when ideas change. This expresses something quite insightful in the sense that we move our body maybe based on how we think, on what we think. And of course, what I have showed you is that there is no consensus. And some argue that these epistemologically based emotions, intellectual emotion, cognitive activities, maybe we should put them a specific name, remains a bit of a mystery. I think it is a mystery that I want to unravel and keep studying in the future, because there is something there. A lot of researchers over decades has pointed towards them, but no enough attention has been received. Secondly, this insightful comment from Richie Vitti's article, which I highly recommend, on the expression, the facial expression of doubt. He expresses what I think is the state of the art. It was in 2014, but I think it's the same today. We know little, and we should study more the facial expressions of conversation and externalization of cognitive process. We don't know enough. And what I felt, and the image I put in the background is not a coincidence. I think we are dealing with a Hydra effect problem. When I started studying the subject, I felt like every time I cut the head of the Hydra, every time I try to solve a question, I say, oh, I find the answer. 2 more questions arise. So in this subject, I think there are more questions than answers. And that, I think, shows us that there is a promising field to develop here. And last but not least, I'm putting Paul, not because he invited me, but because he has a very insightful recommendation for the future that has passed the test of time. And I have always find that text very, very insightful, but his recommendation to me has been one of the most important things that I have learned over the years, because it suits us perfectly well to express what has been found in the facial expression studies. And the recommendation is, the main challenge for the semiotics of gestures will be to be able to question its models and implicit theories. And I think that in the years that have passed, we have not questioned the models of the face enough, and we are using implicit theories on how the face works, usually with the emotional lens. And I think it's time we start questioning more them, which is something that's happening with, like Feldman Barrett, Maria Gendron, Alan Friedlund, James Russell, Fernandez Dolz, Carlos Crivelli. It's happening in the field, not not enough maybe, but it's been happening. And I think that Paul is pointing to a very important direction. We should question these theories and stop using them as a given. So I want to finish. Thank you for the people that have connected today. A special thanks to Paul Wisak for the invitation and trusting that this little psychologist from Argentina could bring something interesting to the table, to this wide and interesting community. And also a special thanks to the people that have inspired me over the years and have helped me over these years, like Desmond Morris here accompanying me in a bust. You cannot see him, okay. Fernando Poyatos, Vincent Denot, Ronald Riggio, Judy Hall, Joe Navarro, Fabian Ramsayer, Mark Frank, Miles Patterson, Nora Dunbar, Alan Friedlund, and Valerie Manusov. Of course, I end with a special greeting for my students, some of whom are connected here. Thank you for being here. And please, panel, remember, this is my first English presentation, so be merciful with me. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, both content-wise and visually very, very rich. So now I will leave the stage to the panel with their questions. As a reminder, we're first going with all the questions, and then Alan will answer them all at once. And I will take the occasion also to remind our attendees that they can ask questions in the question and answer button at the bottom of the screen, and if we have time, we will also try and answer any questions they might have asked. So, without further ado, I will leave the stage to Professor Nair with her questions.
Thank you. It's an honor to ask the first question, and I want to thank you for including me on the panel, and also I want to thank the speaker, Paul Crawley, for an extremely concise presentation, which also covered a lot of ground. So I want to begin with what he said at the end. And at the end, he said, of course, you know, we should not repeat the mistakes of the past. And Paul Buisak's comment was also that we should sort of think creatively. But I do want to ask a question about the past, which is that, in my opinion, Darwin, who was mentioned right at the beginning, is somebody who did a great service to studies of emotional expressions in human beings, but also performed what I think of as a beheading. That is, he separated the face from the rest of the body. And that trend has continued throughout to a great extent, and in the present presentation, where we think in terms of, again, facial expressions and not the body. But we know that from later studies, and I'll mention just Penfield's homunculus, which is the motor strip neuron in the head, which shows that although the face is important, it is linked to the rest of the body. So to some extent, I think that the beheading that Darwin performed should not be repeated in present-day studies in thinking about conversational expression, because we do use our hands and various limbs in talking. So the first question has to do with the role of the body, my first question, and whether we need to stitch together the face and the body much more today. The second type of question that I have concerns what you said about evolution, and that again goes back to Darwin. In social sciences generally and in psychology, we say that ontology recapitulates phylogeny, which basically means that if we look at a child developing over 4 years, their language skills, their motor skills, and also their cognitive skills, one of the things we find is that there is a kind of arc, and the child does not. So I wanted to know whether you didn't mention child language studies at all, but in fact, they may be critical in our understanding the evolution of expressions, as well as how things progress, and which emotions or which cognitions, like Darwin thought, reflection came last. So did shame and guilt. So in other words, we need to look more closely at child language behavior, and also, of course, at the cultural connections, which you mentioned but did not develop, because different cultures, in India, for example, we have a very complex theory of emotional expressions, which is Bharata's theory, which every child is familiar with because they learn dance. So the third aspect that I wanted to talk about is, I wanted you to talk about, was things like literature, dance, music, so many modes where in effect, the culture is rethinking the cognitive processes, and therefore, you have this kind of layering. You did mention this, but I think that this aspect of culture needs to go further. So those would be my comments. And last, to end very quickly, I did want to also ask you a question out of Pavlov, who said, the body is the language is the second signaling system. The body is the primary signaling system. And what I wanted to ask you is, Darwin, when he sends out his questionnaire to 30 countries, asking them how is surprise expressed in your culture, how is anger expressed, how is doubt expressed, and we've been repeating the questionnaire. One of the things he does is to include yes and no in his list of emotions. My question to you, why does he do so? Because it moves to the cognitive front. Second, he does not include two emotions, which most people say are very complex, involve cognitions and emotion, love and hate. My question to you is why you think he doesn't include these. That's enough for now. I have many more questions, but those were my preliminary ones.
Thank you very much, Professor Nair. So we'll get the answers at the end. So I will get to the second member of our panel, Professor Rector, please.
Hello, good morning here at least. Thank you very much for your talk. It was very informational and insightful. It was so insightful that I have many questions. I remember reading about Desmond Morris saying that he had collected more than 3,000 human actions, and that in order to publish it, he reduced it to one book, Man Watching, and the other one in People Watching. I ask you, how are you at the moment limiting your studies? Because you have to put a limit somewhere. And in this limit comes the second question. Are you using photos? Are you using the face and movement? Or are you using the face plus the upper body? Because when you gave that example of low urgency, what caught my attention was you shrugging the shoulders, So how important is it to connect a part of the body to the face, which Rukmini already mentioned. And a question that I don't know if you have studied this yet is when you are analyzing the person, do you think that there is consciousness on the part of the person who is making the gesture? And can there be control on the gesture? Because this would be very interesting. For instance, you could write a manual for job interviews, what a person should do and what a person should not do, and even for politicians, how to communicate in a better fashion. Well, these are small questions, but some answers will give a whole book. So I thank you once more, and I leave it here.
Thank you very much for your questions. And next, Professor Chapdelaine-Feliciati, please.
So as a lawyer, my question for you would be, how could you apply your theories and methodology in a courtroom, for example, with a jury, when the defense attorney, for example, and the prosecutor are trying to evaluate the likelihood of winning their case? That would be my first scenario question. The second one I have for you is the aspect of contagion with facial signs. There's a phenomenon that we're concerned about right now with TikTok and young women who are acquiring some tics, possibly even Tourette syndrome in the West. And there's a concern for this. So could you talk a little bit about the possibility of contagion with regards to this? And my third question, but that could be for another, actually, we have so many interesting concepts to cover together. But another concern is when we teach online and our classrooms are filled with dark screens, how can that affect our ability as professors to read the class? And that's why in my classes, I really insist on students having their cameras on to be able to see if they're following or not. So perhaps that could be also further research. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chapdelaine-Feliciati. Hope Alan is taking notes of all the questions, so we can go forward with Professor Pietro Paolo. Please, you can go. Sorry, you are currently muted.
Unmute. Thank you. Now, first of all, congratulations for a very stimulating paper. Give a view of facial semiotics that I have been thinking about a little bit, but without a scientific basis for it. My concern has been mostly on the artistic side. And I'm very glad that Professor Nair mentioned before, especially dance. With dance, the history of the theater and the history of the arts, in which facial semiotics, facial expressions have always held a primary role. And my first question to you would be to consider the field of observation. What field of observation do you use in your empirical studies? I ask this because my main interest is in the area of combined gestures, facial, physical, and vocal, and not so much facial gestures in isolation, but especially these combined gestures as signifying and communicative structures used by actors on stage, whose purpose it is to show characters communicating with each other, and at the same time to show themselves as performers for an audience. Both interlocutors, the characters on stage, must interpret the facial expressions of the other characters as characters, and the audience must interpret the facial expressions of the same people, but as performers, performing for them something that is signifying and aesthetically pleasing at the same time. Now, the reason why the stage is a very good, I believe, laboratory of observation for facial expressions is that the expressions are, first of all, magnified for visibility. Secondly, they are, and this is very important, uncluttered by the kind of undesirable muscular movement that just happens to occur at the same time, because maybe we're not feeling very well and so on. All of these things are unsignifying in social interactions, but they are isolated instead in the purposeful actions of actors on stage, particularly pantomime, which does not use vocal expressions, but only facial expressions and physical expressions to communicate not only emotional states, but especially ideas and the syntax of ideas, to construct them together into a narrative, into an argument as well. The very first vocabulary for such expressions that I know of was constructed by John Weaver, who was a dancer in the early 18th centuries, performing in London in the early 1700s. A vocabulary of facial gestures and physical gestures that indicate mental states, and that are both emotional as well as cognitive. There not being a clear separation between emotions and thought that we sometimes assume has always been made in the present, but it really hasn't. And in the arts, the two have not always been easy to separate, or indeed it has never been really desirable to separate them. So my question, one of my questions would be, what are the limitations on this sort of research that are imposed on us by our field of observation? I myself choose the theater because I come from the theater and I study of the theater, and so it is easier for me to see the theater as a laboratory for such kind of facial semiotics. In social interactions, as well as in the theater, there are other phenomena that occur. And one of these phenomena is that if I see someone coming into my room smiling, I automatically smile back. It enkindles, it sort of motivates me unconsciously to produce the same kind of facial expression. And that facial expression must be, in my mind, generates a thought as well, not just an emotion. If I see a person reacting, as in class, for example, when our classrooms are not darkened, if I see a student reacting to what I have to say by raising his eyebrows and by smiling and so on, then I interpret that in a particular way. And I continue and present my argument, emphasizing certain parts of it that I had not perhaps intended to emphasize before, or bringing in other examples as a way, simply as a result of my interpretation of his facial expression, and vice versa. In other words, it's a little bit like playing a game of ball catch. If I have a ball to throw you sort of try to guess from my expression what I will do. And so you put yourself in readiness to receive it and to react back. And so that gestures in this sense are not only signifying, but also communicative. And that this communicative and signifying expression at the same time, which you sort of separated by saying what is social and what is cognitive, I thought at one point. In the arts, both are used at the same time, particularly in the theater. And they're used in support of each other. And my third question is, they are not sometimes used in support of each other, but in performing the most complex, one of the most complex acts of cognition and communication, which is that of irony. You can have a verbal message and a facial message that emphasizes the same structure, or a facial message that undermines it and teaches you to, and sort of compels you to, or induces you to think of the very opposite meaning. So when I say something, and I want you to understand the very opposite of what I say, which is the structure of irony, sometimes the facial expression can be used exactly for that purpose. And that is a very complex cognitive act. It is not an emotional act, not something that can be easily dismissed. Not that emotions should be dismissed, but sometimes in these sort of studies, the emotions say, well, this is just an emotion. It's not really cognition. That is a very complex syntactical and cognitive act, which is the undermining of all the words that are being said and of the order in which they're being said, so that you actually get the very opposite meaning of the dictionary meaning that the words indicate. I'll stop at that point, but if there's a chance later on, I'll have other things to say. But thank you.
Thank you for your questions. And finally, Professor Gramigna, please.
Thank you, Alan. I found your paper really rich and fascinating, so well done. I have a few questions. I'm going to go straight to my points. The first concerns the, let's say, historical part, the recognition that you gave starting from Darwin. I was wondering whether there are traces of these trends of linking together cognitive states and facial expressions before Darwin, especially in their history of physiognomy. Perhaps it could be a good way to kind of go back whether and check whether other scholars that have dealt mainly with physiognomy have sometimes dealt with this as well. The second point is a little bit, let's say, a tricky question in the sense that how can we be sure that we are not falling into the trap of determinisms? Because also in this approach, as well as it was done in the ancient physiognomy, somewhat we posit a connection, a link between what's inside and what's outside. So in your case, between cognitive activities, the brain, the mind, and our body, so our face. So how can we avoid this kind of, let's say, deterministic bias? The third point is about methodology. I think was already been raised by Professor Rector before. So how do we go about studying this very fascinating object of study empirically? Do we look at pictures? Do we look at, do we do experiments? Do we use people in real settings and so forth? The fourth point is about this. In your experience, does the repetition of a facial display over time transform some features of the face itself? So basically, if I keep on frowning all the time, because when I focus, for instance, I frown a lot. So I was wondering whether there is a link between the repetition of a certain facial expression linked with cognitive states on the, let's say, the way the face looks like. And finally, I was wondering whether the mental activity of impaired people, so people who have some problems with dealing with cognitive states, or so whether you have registered any difference in, let's say, normal people or people who have mental disorders, basically. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you very much to all the panelists for their questions. Before I leave the stage to Alan Crawley with his answers, I'll just point out that there are a couple of questions from the public. We can take them after we disentangled all the other questions, with which is going to be enough already. So please go on. Thank you.
Okay, so just a couple of things to mention. First, I am mostly theoretical researcher. I tend to read the literature in as many fields as I can, trying to have the overarching perspective. And at the moment, I'm not conducting specific research on this matter. I have done a literature review and an understanding of something that I think is very intriguing, and I maybe want to conduct my PhD on the matter, but it's, I don't know, it's difficult to choose just one subject. I just jump around from one another. So to start with Nair, yes. Indeed, I separated the head from the body with a specific idea. This is a summary of a 3-hour lecture in which I also mentioned body positions related to cognitions. And it's true that we are following a tradition of Darwin dissecting the face. Duchenne made the same as an anatomist, and I think it has proven to be useful in many cases, but of course, it's not the whole picture. It's like thinking the face is just like emotions. If you think that the face is the most important part of the body, well, maybe you should consider the voice, maybe you should consider positions, the dynamic of the way someone walks, the way they dress themselves, the appearance. So we need to consider everything. But to the purpose of dissecting how cognitions work, I think that we should start with dissection and then construct from there. So, for instance, I haven't found any research that posits that the arm position is related to confusion, doubt, or uncertainty. But there is some research relating certain facial expressions to comprehension, uncertainty, and doubt. So I think it's wise to not try to chew too much, considering the whole body, and try to dissect starting from the face as a useful manner. So that's the first thing. The second, I agree with you, child language study should be very useful. I didn't consider them, I didn't find them when I did the review of the literature. But the thing that I have read, and I don't recall where, is that researchers suppose that these facial expressions of cognitions tend to appear after the typical displays of emotion. So they could they appear after this first one. It's a supposition, but I think it could be interesting to study child development, the ontogeny of the development of these displays, and see what we can find there. Yes, the cultural aspect, I don't have much to say because there is no cross-cultural studies on these displays. I think that it was one of the slides I was going to publish, like questions for the future, but I had to limit the slides and I leave it out. But one of the questions was, hey, we need cross-cultural research on this. We don't know nothing. So maybe in the future, someone is interested in doing that. Please reach me out. Please, let's have a conversation because there is something there. Of course, I agree. Regarding emotions and love, what's a difficult question? I don't know what Darwin thought. I know what researchers think right now at the moment in the Ekman's article when he asked about the basic emotions. Most of them, they choose like love wasn't an emotion, was like a sentiment, which is like a more complex affect that's more prolonged, more stable, that is compound of several different emotions. I think that could be one of the reasons, and that sentiments are expressed through specific emotions over time. So you could express your love through anger, through sadness, through fear, and love doesn't have a stereotypical or prototypical way of expressing it, rather than it tend to happen with the more basic emotions. But I don't have an answer for you, Nair. I'm doing my best as I can. So that would be the first questions. Thank you for them. Monica. So, okay. So very simple questions, but also they are very profound in many, many ways. So how do we limit the study of these expressions? I am not sure. So I am just starting to unravel what I think I understand on the matter, and I'm not sure. But if I follow the steps of my long distance master, the person I mostly admire in the world, here is Desmond Norris seeing us from behind, that we need to first do naturalistic observation, description without interpretation. Just go into the field, taking notes, seeing the behaviors with a facial action coding system, or with hopefully the human ethogram that Desmond is still developing at his 94 years old. He has, last year he wrote 4 books or 5 books. He's still very insightful in many, many ways. He's very lucid. I interviewed him recently. I talked with him about this presentation yesterday and the day before. And I think that we need to study first with description. We need to go to the field. We need to focus mostly on the face, but also on the body, of course. But we need to select a place to start. So that's a methodological limitation, I think, but it's needed. I know we are dissecting the body, and that's a huge point from Nair. So I think there are a lot of possibilities. And Peter Collette, which is also a colleague of Desmond from Britain, when I asked him what would be his recommendation for the future of the nonverbal communication field, he told me that we should focus more on the dynamics of behavior. Consider the intensity, the amplitude, the velocity, the acceleration, the direction, because in there, I think, but we still don't know, we're going to find a lot of information. For instance, I had a conversation with Judy Hall, to me, one of the queens of nonverbal communication. And she has several papers of how we communicate nonverbally the dimension of the vertical dimension, of dominance. And there are certain behaviors that people use to infer dominance, but people don't use them all, and they use some behaviors that are not related to dominance, but even though they are giving the correct answer about, yes, this person is dominant. And they are not using the same cues that we think are the important ones. So my argument is maybe the dynamic of the execution of those behaviors is showing that someone is dominant. So in the dynamics, I think I'm going to find, and Peter Collette's observation is quite good, that we need to focus on how the execution of the action is performed, not only in the form of it. So, okay. And the other one is the consciousness question. That's going to arise lots of time. And I think that one of the things we should do to pursue a better understanding is that assume that we should leave out dichotomy. We should think about a spectrum of consciousness, going from non-conscious to more conscious. And we are going to find that as it happens with nonverbal behavior, there's a study published by Judy Hall on self-accuracy, and people are more conscious of the emblems, like this kind of behaviors. Then they are a little less conscious on smiling, for instance. Then the gestures of the hands, and last, the behavior that we call adapters, manipulators, the way we touch ourselves or play with objects. So I think we're going to find that these facial displays of cognitions are going to be able to be graded from more conscious to less conscious. But that's something we are going to unravel with observation, but also with questions. So it would be interesting to ask people, like, put the face you would put if you hear something that confuses you, put the face if something you see is surprising, and else, all these cognitive states. And then we can show them videos of their reactions and study not only the dynamics, but also ask them about their reactions and think about how conscious they were at the execution when we asked them to pose them, and at times we didn't ask them to pose them. So we need to create different approaches, taking from the literature of what has been done, but also adapting with new considerations. So thank you, Monica, for the questions. Regarding Clara, so in the courtroom, I will argue that the best thing I can recommend you is the work of Vincent Deneau, my friend and colleague. He's a wonderful person. He's the most knowledgeable expert on the field of nonverbal communication in the judicial system. And he will argue that nonverbal cues in that context should be used very cautiously. And the most important thing is to avoid what's wrong. Rather than to look for the cues that are good to observe, is you need to know about the biases, the heuristics, the myths regarding nonverbal communication. And these are the things you don't need to do, and please avoid them. So he has a phrase that's like, at times, I'm not sure what's the right thing to do, but I'm sure what's not the way to do things. So I think that that's very important in the courtroom situation. Regarding how these displays could work, I think that as a lawyer, you could use them to understand that someone is like thinking hard or having trouble to answer, or maybe when someone is pushing out the tongue. I did it when I was writing some of your questions. It's usually connected to, there are a couple of studies on this, concentration and in motor mimicry, but also in thought. Michael Jordan, when he played the basket, he also stick out the tongue, and he already comments on that it was useful for his concentration, and his father and his grandfather also did it when he was working at the workshop, garage. So we need to understand a lot of these facial expressions, and when we understand their probabilistic association, because I think that's Rimo's question on the determinism. Okay, we should not follow that path. You are completely right. We should follow what I argue is a more probabilistic association paradigm, in which every time you see a behavior, it has some probabilistic association with a meaning, but it also could mean B, C, D, and you have to collect a lot of other gestures, other behaviors to start to generate inferences about what's going on. But as we could see, behaviors does not work as a rompecabezas, as a head breaker. It's not a head breaker. As a puzzle. Thank you. Exactly. The meaning of gestures is in fact a mystery. When gestures could be polysemic, multifunctional, multicasual. So we should not be deterministic. I completely agree with that. And interpretation of behaviors, it's somehow similar to art. sometimes application of this understanding of the meaning of behaviors, it's leaving behind the science that allows you to make the inferences, but in the practice, nonverbal communication may turn into art in how you interpret how others move themselves. Because I have talked with a lot of Spanish nonverbal communication specialists, and you could show them a video, and no one is going to say the same about that video, even if they know the same literature. Why? Because interpretation has a little bit of science, but a lot of art. And in the future, we need to understand how to develop more methods and models to understand the probabilistic association between meanings and gestures, but also to comprehend that we are far from really understanding the connection, the veridical connection, the genuine connection between how we express and what we feel. We still don't grasp it. I mean, Carrie Keating, Valerie Manusov, Judy Hall, but Carrie Keating's comments are in the Upper Handbook when she writes like a review on what we know about the face. It's like we still don't grasp it. We still need to understand a lot of things about it, and we cannot go out there thinking like, this is easy. It's that's emotion, that contempt, anger. Let's move on. It's more complicated than that, and I don't have the answer. And these researchers also don't have the answer. So that's promising in the sense that we have a lot of research to do, which is like something nice to hear for us, at least. That for courtroom contagion. I don't know of how these displays of cognition are contagious. I think they may be contagious, as well as the emotional displays, as yawning, as smiling, as laughing. I'm sure there must be a common thread there, but I have no clue. I have no clue. So maybe that's something to research. And the other one regarding the black screen and people not turning on the camera. First, thank you, panel, for putting the camera. It's a pleasure seeing you. And secondly, I recently gave a lecture to a hospital in Colombia. So it's different culture. No one turned on the camera, just one woman. I think my lecture was fine. I thought that, but people felt like it was strange that my style was maybe some arrogant, some too energetic, some inadequate. But as I couldn't see the faces of them, I was not feeling the mood, the temperature of the audience, so I couldn't adapt myself. And that brings something very important, for instance, for the question that Monica told us of job interviews. What I have found in nonverbal communication is that there is a little secret, the secret sauce. What Marianne Schmidt must tell us is the behavioral adaptability. The ability to adapt your nonverbal behavior to interlocutor, to your partner in conversation, it's one of the most important things. When you are able to adapt yourself to the different styles of other people and other cultures, that's a superpower. That's amazing. I'm sure that based on what I have read, that that skill is going to be very, very important in the future. I think so. So thanks, Laura, for the questions. I'm going to Pietro Pablo right now. Regarding the field of observation, I think naturalistic study are, as I told before, it's completely important. And theater expressions are something that I have studied, but very, very little. My mother is a choreographer. I work at a theater when I was young, and I work at one of the most important theaters here in Argentina, the Teatro Maipo, for a couple of years. And I work at the background, like a stage manager. So I interacted with a lot of actors, and it's quite interesting. I've tried to help them with the recommendation on the expressions, and they were not like, I don't care. I do my thing. Please, I don't care. It was their style. They were professionals. I was younger. I understand that. But what I have saw is the same as you in the sense that the face is in theater, in opposition to the cinema, it's stylized and exaggerated. In cinema, it's more twitches and subtleties. In the theater, you have to convey the same messages to the first row and to the last, and that's quite hard. That's really, really difficult. I can't do that. I mean, when I was young, I did some participation in the theaters. I did act when I was less self-conscious of my limitations. And once I grew older, it was like no more, but I did enjoy it. And I'm not sure how to contribute more with that, Pietro Pablo. I think that there are a lot of things you mentioned, like the Weaver vocabulary on the melted states, which I think I didn't know it. I haven't heard of it, and I will look for it, which seems very, very interesting. And you also mentioned about the separation on cognition and emotion. Yes, usually most researchers are not going to separate them, and that's fine. Most of the time we are feeling both of them at the same time, but I will argue that at certain moments we feel one of those dimensions, the cognitions of the emotions, with more intensity, and that intensity could be the thing that predominantly be expressed, and the other thing could be behind. I don't know, these are hypotheses, but I think that dissecting the same way we are dissecting the body and dissecting emotions from cognitions will help us to start developing a theory. But over time, we need to put all the boxes together. We are doing what Robert Sapolsky tells us is the buckets of knowledge, temporal buckets of knowledge we are using to understand a subject, and then we change the bucket and we see the same thing through different lenses. And nonverbal communication has been seen through the lenses of photography, of dance. I have a pretty good book that I'm so sorry I haven't read, because it will be very interesting for us today. It's called To Dance is Human, A Theory of Nonverbal Communication from Judy Lynn Hanna. It would help me answer some questions on the dance things, but I have no experience in that. And there are lots of things. There's too much. I'm trying to do my best with this. And the question of the irony, yes. The contradiction, the deliberate contradiction between the channels to show specific social messages. That's a very complex kind of messages to send. You need to be a good communicator, or at least a good sender of certain messages, to be able to accurately and precisely and unambiguously send messages of sarcasm or irony. And that's something I have seen a little bit of studies on sarcasm and irony. I'm not so much informed about them, but there are a few. And I think it would be interesting to better grasp what's happening there. I completely agree, yes. So thank you very much, Domenico, for your questions, and also for your face, your nodding, your smiles during the presentation. That helped me a lot. And last but not least, Remo. It's interesting. Of course, there is some mentions over, I think, Lebrun, the painter. I think there are some traces of some, not to mention researchers, maybe painters, sculptors that have mentioned some of the face that convey cognitions. Yes, I should look for them and look more closely to that. I've decided to start with Duchenne because I think that before them, as it is expressed in this marvelous book from François de Laporte, The Anatomy of Passions. Oh my God, one of the best written books that I have seen. It's impeccable. And he argues that before Duchenne, the facial expression didn't exist because it was a mesh of complex muscles that were not independently recognized. And after Duchenne, with the Faradization and the electrifying of the face of a shoemaker that had anesthesia, facial anesthesia, for the first time we started to understand the specific locations and movements of the facial muscles. But you're right, we should look for more cues in historical background. I agree with that. The fourth question about how facial expression leave traces of the way you use your body, your face. And this is something I have been talking with a colleague, and indeed, there is something there. The way we use our face tend to leave some traces in lines and bagging of the wrinkles, bagging of skin, but also in the hypertrophy of the face. So, for instance, there's a study from Sahonk in the 70s that couples that live together like for 20 years, they tend to develop the same facial muscle. They hypertrophy the same facial muscles, and their faces tend to appear themselves for spending so much time experiencing Clara the contagion of the facial displays of the other person, and they tend to look alike. So I think, and over time, there's a very interesting quote. Let me see if I can tell it. So the idea is this: when you reach your 40s or 50 years, your face tends to be the one you deserved based on the way you move your face over your life. When you are born, you have the face you have, and over time, you develop your own facial displays, your own facial appearance when you are resting the face. So I think there is something there that hasn't received so much attention because it's so close to physiognomy and physiognomists. And that, I think, scares a lot of researchers, like trying to unravel something that is very, very related to pseudoscience. But I think that we could find some traces. Like, I tend to frown also. I have a lot of wrinkles here because when I walk on the street, I am very antisocial. I don't want people to approach myself. I want to have my time. And my face reflects my social intention of, please stay away. And we all have this predisposition in our own faces. So I think that's very, very insightful, and we need more research on that. And there is a research on the social class and the faces at rest that shows us that I think it was like people with more social, with more income, more economically, I don't have the word, but if you had more income and you're socially more on the ladder and the upside of the ladder, you tend to have a face at rest more happy in comparison with the sum of the faces of people low in the ladder of social income and education, which shows us that the way you live your life, the things you experience, tend to change the way you have your face at rest. And for instance, and this is the last thing, and I know I'm saying too much things, there are a couple of photographs of people prior to the war and after the war, and that's a huge difference. And it's not based on scars; it's based on the experience they had, which I think it shows us that our experience are metaphorically carved in our face. Thank you, Remo.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alan, for your very exhaustive answers. And now there are a few questions from the attendees, from the public. I don't know if you can see them in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If you want to quickly answer them.
Yeah, wrong. I'm trying to read them. If I understand correctly, Juan Capena, a student of mine, thanks for being here. Gabriel, you want to answer the question? No, you're putting the comment. Okay, yeah, I understand.
Yeah, sorry, no,
yeah.
It's for you. I'm just setting it up.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks. I usually, what I see is that there's an overlap between the cognitive expression of something that's happening in the inside and the conversational message. Like, I don't understand. Please be more clear. Please explain further this. I can't understand. Or the expression, I understand. Yeah, I comprehend what you're saying, but it's simultaneous. What I'm feeling here and what I want to express. Also, thanks for that. I don't know about the polyvagal lens in the improvisation, Shirley, to make a connection between the topic. I'm so sorry, but I don't have something there. Regarding the movements of the face in musicians and the orchestra, I have very little information. I know some comments from one of the leading experts in facial expressions, David Matsumoto, in one of his books, 2013. One of the greatest books that has that was able to have a very theoretical first part and a very practical second part, and how you could apply nonverbal communication in the airport, in police, in the judicial system, with clinicians. It's very interesting. And he argues that low-pitch sounds tend to decrease the movement of the eyebrows, and high-pitched sounds tend to increase, tend to raise the eyebrows when someone is playing music. I don't think that's all of the time, most of the time, but I think there's something there that I don't understand. Yes, there's something there. Yes. So that's what I can tell you about that. So Han, let's move with Han. Well, that's the question we are looking for with machine learning, and I don't have the answer. I mean, we need a lot of data, a lot of experience, a lot of research in order to be able to get away with deterministic models, like, for example, tell us that face is expressing 7% contempt, 2% sadness, and 1% anger. What's that? That's nothing. That's not helping us. That's confusing us. And the method is flawed. The theory is flawed. And I'm not the one saying it. Dennis Kuster, Eva Krumhuber from Germany, two leading experts on the field, explain it much better than me. But I'm the one here, so I'm translating the words. Paraphrasing, of course. And so we need to use a probabilistic association, but I mean, I'm not sure the way we should pursue. If it's a collection of several frequencies of actions, of a collection of the intensity of the action, what is the threshold in which we make the inference? I don't know. We have to do the research. And I think in the future, facial expressions of cognitions, facial displays, are going to be quite useful in very, very different scenarios that we are not seeing right now. And in my experience, this is my experience, they tend to appear, the conversational and cognitive displays tend to appear more frequently than the emotional ones. And in Bavelas and Chauville 2018 paper, they tell us exactly that. So thanks, Han, for the question and being here today. Euripides, thank you very much. I appreciate your comment. It has been a pleasure, and I have prepared myself to give my first English presentation a little bit. I did my best as I could. The movement of the eye, Michael. So let's go with that. Great. You know, the other day when I invited Judy Hall to the presentation, she told me, have you read something on the eye direction and cognitive load? And I was like, I missed that part. And she sent me the article. I have it on my email, but I couldn't read it for today. And I will add it up. I just couldn't. But evidently, the direction of the eyes and how they move are related to cognitions, not in the way that the PNL or NLP, you know what I'm talking about, PNL or NLP, Programación Neurolinguistic programming, that you looked up to the right, you are remembering something, you look up to the, to the left, you're remembering, to the right, you are reminding. That's not the case. We know the research that has been done that cast out this kind of pseudoscientific propositions. But all in all, also in my experience, when I talk with someone and I need to think, it's like, okay, I will look to another place to avoid all distractions and concentrate in my thinking. Maybe I can close my eyes. Maybe musicians, when they are also playing the parts, they are not only closing the eyes in order to express the emotions or live the emotion more intensely, it's also a way to concentrate themselves and leave out all the faces in the audience, all the lights, and concentrates in the part, in the feeling of the music. And of course, I will argue that the eyes are related to cognition. Yes, completely agree with you, Michael. Thank you for the question. Also, there's one more. Shirley Okran. Wow, that's a complex one. I will say one thing, and is if you want to understand the idiosyncratic ways in which people move their faces, you should read the work of Herman. I don't know his last name. He's from Amsterdam, I think. I saw him on Zoom a couple of weeks ago, and he has found some 4 characteristically repertoires of ways of moving the face and how they are related to the way people conduct themselves in conversations and personality, which I think is kind of interesting. He has opened a new field with that. For instance, saying, okay, let's forget emotions in the face and let's see what we can find in the face. And that's one of the things Paul recommendation brings to the table. It's like, let's question the thing we're doing and try to focus on better understanding how the face really moves in social interactions. And that's one of the things I have tell Desmond Morris, like, why didn't you write a book on facial expression? Like, he was like, Paul Ekman saturated the subject, but like, it's enough. I will dedicate to other things. And I was like, no, you should write the book. It's not too late. Well, there are a lot of things to understand better on the facial displays, facial expressions, the feedback hypothesis and how that can change, and as well as, for instance, how smiling at a given moment could be used to express a positive feeling, the pleasure of being here, and showing people that I'm spending a nice time together. At the same time, a certain facial action could signify 3 different things. And this complicates it. This shows us, as Remo advises, we should not be deterministic. We cannot be deterministic because we still don't grasp the complexity of the face. And I don't remember who said it. I think it's Valery Manusov, but I'm not sure. Psychologists have only scratched the surface of facial expression. And I will argue, yes, we are still in the surface, and hopefully we'll dig deeper in the future. The recording, yes, it seems that the recording is going to be published, and hopefully it received good comments. So thank you for all the questions. Thank you to the panel. Thank you, Paul. Thank you for all the people that have attended. It has been a pleasure. And hopefully in the future you can reach me out, have conversations. I hope I have translated what I feel about nonverbal communication, that I am passionate about it, and that we need to enjoy this endeavor, which is very, very, thanks.